example ahead of time. This is the way the story evolved. I'm going to cartoon it a little bit. It wasn't quite as linear as I'm going to tell it, but it's pretty close. And if you'll pardon me, it's good enough for government work in terms of telling the story. But it's really the way that this has evolved. And again, think of the themes: illustrating community behavior, changing the activities of government bureaucracies. So practitioners. So kind of the way the story began. Say late 99, 2000, somewhere in there. NSA, my center at NSA, had one of our missions of my center. I was the chief of something called the System and Network Attack Center. Despite the ominous name, we were really the good guys. One of our jobs was the Blue Team, the NSA Blue Team. And it was a group that would come out, work cooperatively with system administrators in the DoD. And kind of the usual stuff. You all know what this is, right? Scanning and configuration analysis and so forth. What can we do? Where are you vulnerable? What can we do about it? And as a byproduct of that work, we'd produced a very successful security guide for Windows NT, we called it at the time. And it was kind of a function of the time, right? There were actually many of these things floating around. We actually did a count of this, by the way. There were like 14 of them in the U.S. government, sponsored by various agencies at various points. And for us, it was both a training vehicle, it was a giveaway thing, it was kind of a benchmark, and it was just something we could give to customers, even whether we could visit them or not. And it started to take off. It got fairly popular. We kept it current. And eventually became adopted by DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency, as their STIG, if you know what that is, a Security Technical Instruction Guide, I think. But it became the benchmark for DISA. And so about that time, Windows 2000 started to emerge as a new concern for the Defense Department. What are we going to do about Windows 2000? How can we roll it out? In particular, what are we going to do about operational security? How should we configure it for security? And when I say, the DoD makes a decision, remember that there is no single, unified, completely managed entity called the DoD, right? It's a very big, complex confederacy of all kinds of issues around IT ownership and policies. And it's very complex. So it's always a mistake to say the DoD did this, but I'll say that for cartoonish purposes. So we looked at this, and my team showed up one day, and they said, Tony, this Windows 2000 thing's a lot bigger than this NT. And we're not sure that we could put together a credible security guide for Windows 2000 and keep it current over time. Right? Because one of my sayings is, if you're in the security guidance business or the security advice business, you're in it forever. Right? You have to be prepared if you're supporting operational users. If you're going to be the advice giver, you got to be there for them for the operational lifetime of that technology in their environment. That is very challenging in something as complex as the DoD, which still has, I'm sure, Windows 98 machines and things like that running around out there. So it's very complex. So our team comes up and says, Tony, we're just not sure we could do this. And so I thought about it for a few seconds, and we talked about it. And I said, fine. Let's make a list of everybody in the U.S. government that has something like this, a Windows NT security guide. And let's call them up and see if they want to work together. See if we can share labor, split the load, do something together. So we literally made a list. I think it was in the mid-teens. We started calling. And here's one of the secrets of government life. Some of you will know this story. That list of 14 had evaporated by the end of an afternoon as we called around trying to find the points of contact. So what had happened? Organizations, people had been reorganized out of existence, funding had disappeared, maybe they adopted our guide or the DISA STIG or whatever happened. That list of 14 just kind of evaporated. And left standing at the end were our friends at DISA. I think Navy SPAWAR was still involved at some level. And that was kind of it. And I said, well, that's not a lot of help. With all respect to my friends at DISA, we need more than this. I think I'll call SANS up and see what they're doing, because they had this Windows NT step-by-step guide. And this was consistent with a belief that was starting to come to me at the time. I said, well, why is this Defense Department problem any different than the rest of government problem, any different than the rest of the country's problem? I'm not sure I can find any difference. So maybe we can find a way to take advantage of that, right, to work together across these communities. And I talked to them, and then there was a little nonprofit starting up called the Center for Internet Security. Kind of in the same business, kind of in the same business, but very focused on the commercial side of this, and security benchmarks was their term for something like this. And out of that, out of several conversations and meetings to kind of, put all the wizards in the room and sort through, I believe you should set this registry key to that, and blah, blah, blah. One of the great challenges and exciting things about this business, right, it draws really, really bright, really, really opinionated people who will fall on their sword for the last registry setting and, and so forth. So getting everybody past that was quite challenging. And I call it's a classic exercise in herding cats. Right? All these cats in a room, and they're all really bright, and they all have strong opinions. But at the end of the day, we emerged with what we call the consensus for Windows 2000. I wrote an open press article that's floating around on the web, and I'll give you a link later if you're interested, but to explain from NSA's perspective why did we move in this direction and why we thought it was important. That came out in 2000 or so. And so, but the idea was, let's organize the practitioners. That's the bottom line. Go find the folks like us. Go find the folks that have a similar mission. And if you can't convince yourself that you have a dramatically different problem, then why not work together and solve that problem together, right? So it was gathering folks like this up into a room. And once we got the technical peers to look at each other, frankly, most of us were too embarrassed to fall on our sword for that last registry setting, the bottom line, right? And recognizing that we had a common problem, whether it was the community that NIST serves or SANS or the Center for Net Security or DISA or us, guess what? We all have the same constituency, and we all need to work together to solve it. So really exciting things started to happen once we thought of the problem differently. Let's gather the practitioners. And I did not use that word at that time. And, of course, users, we each, one of the fascinating things was we each brought our own constituency, people who followed our advice, some because they had to, because it was mandated, and some because they chose to for whatever reason. And you don't have to trust NSA, you can trust this or whatever. But my goal was to try and bring those communities together because it just struck me as really odd, like, so why would my customers have to sort out, do I trust the NIST guys more than the NSA folks, more than the DISA folks? That doesn't make sense to me. Why don't we band together? We don't have enough resources. Anyway, any of us, let's work together. Users start to really adopt this stuff in force now. And it became, some people, NIST had their constituency again, CIS, others. Everyone brought their game to the table. But it became kind of an accepted practice, right? I'm going to operate my clients. I'm going to do it this way. And another thing started to emerge, which is some of the big buyers that I would speak with regularly, like at that time the CIO of the Air Force, said, well, if we're going to operate our systems to this, why don't we buy it that way to start with? Why don't we tell the vendor this is the way we want it configured? Right? Think of something as vast as a DoD. Does it really make sense in terms of network security for us to ship wide open, unconfigured for security, all our OSs and applications and hope that every poor slob, undertrained, underloved, under-resourced person at the tail end of the food chain is going to take this and secure it from scratch? Is that a sensible way to tackle something on scale? Of course not. And you're not going to train everybody in the DoD to be a wizard like this community. Right? There just aren't enough of us out there. So it makes sense, ship it that way to start with. So a story is starting to build now, right? Get the practitioners to agree on what constitutes rational security practice. Users start to see this as a useful thing to do. Buyers start to see this as, well, wait a minute, why don't I get this up front? And if there's any Air Force folks in here, you don't have to identify yourselves, but the Air Force has really taken this on nationally and done a great heroic job. So why didn't people do this before? Because applications break, right? You tighten security, bad things happen. And you have to look yourself in the eye, enterprise-wide, and say, boy, I'm going to have to throw away some of these old applications. I'm going to have to spend money to rewrite them. I'm going to have to tell my vendor that it's got to run in this environment. There's some painful choices to be made, and the Air Force has really paved the way on this as a leadership activity for the nation, really making this work. And it works so well that the DoD has done this. So we've worked very closely as the primary advice givers, and we're doing this cooperatively with DISA and with NIST and other friends in this business. But our primary support has been to the Air Force to turn this from Air Force standard to DoD standard. And if you follow the press in this over the spring, you know that OMB, the Office of Management Budget, has mandated this as mandatory for all government agencies. So how did that happen? It's because of folks like my folks and the DISA folks and the NIST folks and the Air Force all getting together and figuring out how we're going to solve this problem at scale. And the key to this was, us, the security geeks, not talking about vulnerability so much, start to talk about registry keys and, operational safe practice and so forth. Create something in their language. And then for the buyers, it was about creating something that they could put into RFPs. Oh, okay, I can tell the vendor to deliver it this way, and I can have an acceptance test for that, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then, of course, you've got the attention of the suppliers. Once you have the buyers thinking this way, the suppliers have to deal with this, right? So you've got the OS vendors, you've got the application vendors. They have to step up and say, okay, I got it. That's the way you want it. And rather than have those NSA geeks at the when I ship the product, make all kinds of bad assumptions about why we did it this way and how the technology works, maybe we should just work with them up front. Let's work with them up front so they got the right information, and we can tell them, we get to see a lot of the breakage issues because we support our customer base. So the big vendors say, as they do. And so working with the security community up front to deliver better operational practice in the form of the shipped product becomes the new model, right? The vendors see that. Another market started to appear, though, partly through encouragement and personal lobbying, and partly because people saw this. So people see large numbers of buyers kind of adopt this practice from NIST or CIS or whatever. And they look at this and they go, oh, well, if people think that's good, well, I've got a scanner or a tool that works in their environment. It's no big deal for me to tweak the tool so that it measures compliance against these standard benchmarks. Okay, so that's a good thing. So I'll just tweak the tool and give them a little added value here. I can tell you, you want to run your clients the NIST way or the NSA way or your servers the way CIS says? No problem. I will add that to my tool. So that market has really started to emerge and become kind of the way we think of this problem. And then I mentioned earlier OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. So people who have oversight, right? So they want to regulate or mandate solutions to the security problem. So they look at this activity and they say, oh, well, this is good. So I want all government agencies to do this because I'll get some sort of known security property out of it. I'll get some value from it. And I can streamline it. I can have a single buy for it. I can make this mandatory, et cetera, et cetera. And a key role that NIST has played in this, if you follow the press on this, there's a program called I'll mention it a bit later, the Security Content Automation Program. It's technically a tri-sponsored thing between us, DISA, and NIST, but it's really homed at NIST. And it bundles up a number of these ideas together and specifically links it to FISMA compliance. Right, so the idea is that, okay, if this represents best practice, how should I operate my IT? Well, I want that linked to oversight things like FISMA that say, I expect you to handle data responsibly, including down to the controls on your IT. Right? So it takes away this wild west of, kind of good intention oversight with uber geeky kind of how do I operate my IT and tries to build a linkage there in a very specific way. And the goal is to dramatically cut the cost of compliance. That is, why do I create a lot of paper to make this mapping? Why don't I build a framework that says, well, if you obey these standards, then you will be in the right direction. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Okay, so stakeholders. So this story starts to build up. Again, the key was to think about it in sort of different terms, in terms of how do we create content differently than we did before. So we didn't design this ahead of time, but the story that's really built a tremendous amount of momentum up over the last year in particular. Now, what was happening behind the scenes that's a little more technical is what I call development of the plumbing of vulnerability. So what the heck is plumbing? Well, plumbing is a way to move content, if you pardon the hokey metaphor, to move content from one place to another, right? So what is the content of vulnerability of our business? Well, it's the news about new IT vulnerabilities. It's things like security guidance and best practice and benchmarks. It's things that we create, that my group creates and lots of you create. Things like red team reports and blue team reports and tests on individual products and their flaws and incident reports. We're tracking what bad folks are doing to our networks and so forth. I call that the content of the vulnerability business. Most of those developed individually. Right? These are pieces of information that are created as an outgrowth of jobs that we all do. But think of them in a much more general sense as information that's all about the vulnerability of the environment. And this content is only valuable to the extent that we can move it somewhere else to solve the problem. Okay, so giving people red team reports is lovely, but what's the purpose of that? It's so that we understand the flaws in our network so we can manage them better. Right? So we need a way to translate what we learn in one dimension, the work that we do, into this different sphere of network management. So what's the plumbing? Well, the plumbing is starting to emerge. This is one set of standards. It's not all. But so plumbing, sort of standards and ways to express this content in a manner that is preferably open standard, available to all, supported by tools, et cetera, et cetera. So